weapons and you promise not to develop them, you will be recognized as having the right to develop nuclear power for peaceful energy purposes. Not only will you have the right, but you will receive assistance from the countries that have nuclear power. Get that? According to this treaty, not only does Iran have the right under international law to have nuclear power plants and to enrich uranium to the point of 4 or 5% that's necessary to run those plants, but it can expect to get help in developing them. And what is the United States and its allies telling Iran? You have to stop enriching uranium. Meanwhile, the NPT also says that those countries that have nuclear weapons already have to make an effort to reduce their stockpiles and eventually do away with them altogether. Is that happening? Is there any country in the world that's reducing its nuclear stockpiles? So it's not Iran that's in violation of the NPT, it's the United States. And yet, it's the United States that's accusing Iran of violating international law and imposed sanctions right after the Iranian Revolution of its own, and then has used its powerful leverage to force the United Nations Security Council to impose 3 separate sets of sanctions against Iran for supposedly violating the NPT. Now, there's a watchdog agency that the UN set up, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, which inspects countries that are signatories to the NPT. And Iran is the most inspected country in the entire world. Not only according to the regular standards that countries are supposed to agree to, but it signed what's called additional protocols, which means it allows more intrusive inspections. And there's no evidence that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon. Just a little technical thing here, because this comes up every once in a while and they never really explain it. Uranium is a natural element found in the earth, and in order to make it useful for producing energy or nuclear weapons, you have to enrich it. It's a technical process that involves taking uranium-235 out of the element 238 through a process of hundreds or thousands of what they call centrifuges that spin the element at a terrific speed and in synchronization with each other. It's a very difficult process to pull off. And Iran's been able to get it to the point of 4 to 5%, where it can develop, can use that energy that enriched uranium for nuclear power. There's been a recent controversy come up because Iran has one nuclear reactor that was actually built under the Shah, under pressure by the United States, that wanted the Shah to develop nuclear power because Westinghouse and General Electric stood to make $6 billion in contracts. And that process started, and the first nuclear reactor was one in Tehran. And it's called the Tehran Research Reactor, or TRR for short. And it's used to make radioisotopes. I don't know what that is, but that's the right word. To help cancer patients. It's used in medical research and treatment. And in order to make that reactor function, you need uranium enriched to a degree of 20%. And so Iran has just announced that it's capable of doing that. In order to make enriched uranium that's powerful enough to trigger a nuclear bomb, or to be the ammunition of a nuclear bomb, you have to enrich uranium to about 95%, which is a much more difficult process. And it involves many more centrifuges, and they have to be reconfigured, set up in a different way, and you can't do that, like after 5 o'clock when the doors are closed. It's a huge operation, and there's no way they can pull it off without not only the IAEA, but the CIA and Mossad and every other Western intelligence agency knowing about it. So that's the argument, on a technical level, that Iran is not trying to develop nuclear weapons. On a political level, President Ahmadinejad says they don't want nuclear weapons because they're not useful anymore. This time has passed. You start a nuclear war, everyone dies. So, which is not an irrational thing to say. Although President Ahmadinejad doesn't have anything to say about nuclear weapons because he's not head of the military. The Iranian president is not the commander-in-chief, as it is in the United States. The commander-in-chief is the supreme leader, who who is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has issued a fatwa, a religious edict with the force of law, saying that it would be against Islam to develop nuclear weapons. Why? Because it's a weapon of mass destruction and it kills the innocent. And if you fight a war, you cannot kill the innocent. Now, people might say, well, you know, so what? They said something, of course they're going to say it. That's just propaganda. But during the 8-year war with Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons against civilians as well as the military of Iran, and when it was bombing cities, civilian populations, using nerve gas, the Iranian military went to the Ayatollah Khomeini, the first supreme leader, and asked him to be able to retaliate in kind, and he said no, because those would be weapons of mass destruction. That would be against Islam. And they didn't do it, and there's no evidence that they did it. See? So, you know, from a technical point of view, from a political point of view, from a religious point of view, there's good arguments against the accusation that Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons. And yet, not a week goes by in the United States that you don't see an article by the Associated Press referring to Iran's nuclear ambitions. And that's an interesting way to phrase it, because what does that mean? That can mean nuclear power plants, or it can mean nuclear weapons. You see? They just throw it out there. Obama's inability to stop Iran's nuclear weapons, the West's inability to accept Iran's nuclear, Ahmadinejad's refusal to disavow Iran's nuclear ambitions. And so the average person thinks, gee, Iran's going to bomb us, if they get the bomb. We can't allow that. How belligerent is Iran? Iran is a country that has not invaded a neighbor or attacked another country in more than 200 years. Unless you count a couple of incursions under the Shah that were done at the behest of the U.S. But certainly in the last 30 years, Iran has not attacked another country. It was attacked by Iraq, and there's not a family in Iran today that wasn't affected in some way by that war. And this is a country that doesn't want war. I don't care where they stand on the political perspective, on the political spectrum. Iranians don't want another war. Did Ahmadinejad call for the destruction of Israel? The quote was that Ahmadinejad said that Israel should be wiped off the map. I take it there's a number of Farsi speakers here. My understanding is there is no such phrase in Farsi, so it would have to be a translation anyway.
What phrase?
Wipe off the map?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, really?
It was mentioned on TV at the time where it was actually, like at the time where...
But that's a Farsi expression.
Yeah, the expression was out. Like,
Okay, I stand corrected. I'll stop saying that. However, that's not what he said. It was a mistranslation. And the original is available, to find you can find it on the internet. And what he said was, as the Imam said, referring to Ayatollah Khomeini, this regime, referring to Israel, must disappear from the pages of history. And when he was asked about that on Democracy Now! By Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez last year when they did an interview with him, and it was videoed, you can see it on the internet, he said, well, he didn't mean a physical destruction, he meant like the collapse of the Soviet Union, that it would fall apart as a result of his own contradictions. He wasn't calling for the destruction of Israel, which makes sense because Iran is not an anti-Semitic country. Iran, in fact, has the largest Jewish population in the Middle East or South Asia of any country in the region except for Israel. Some 30,000 people, and they've been there for 3,000 years. There are 11 functions